Hey everyone, back again. Today I want to talk to you about primitive accumulation from Karl Marx and from the political economists before him like David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all that. So I'm going to explain that to you today. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical ideas and concepts and ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can like, share, subscribe, and see videos I release once every 2 weeks or so. You know, I'm busy. Please consider donating to one of the organizations below to help Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians in need right now. It'd be really great. Anything that you can contribute. Tell your friends about this, maybe if you get a kick out of it. And also, on the topic of primitive accumulation, chime in, because there is some ambiguity around this term, and I'm curious to know what others have to say about it, how you think about this term, how you think Marx is using it. Now I'm going to explain the kind of two central approaches to this term, that is Marx's actual view of it, versus like him just using a term that's kind of been misunderstood. But in any case, let's jump into it. Now I'm pulling this from Karl Marx's first volume of Capital, Capital Volume 1, at the end where he talks about this thing called, quote unquote, primitive accumulation. Now this term actually comes from Adam Smith in the form of previous accumulation. Now, if you don't know, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a very important figure for thinking through the capitalist economy and trying to understand it. In a lot of ways, Marx really likes Adam Smith. Marx thinks that Adam Smith did a lot of really important work trying to decipher how the capitalist economy functions and where value comes from and what labor does and the role of nations and states and all of that. But at the same time, Marx has a lot of problems with Adam Smith. So if you read The Wealth of Nations, which I've covered on this channel if you want a more full-fledged breakdown of over many hours, at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith describes how the division of labor permitted capitalism to essentially come into existence, where the division of labor made it so that instead of artisans, as just one example, having to produce like an entire shoe if they're like a cobbler, instead, now all of the different tasks that go into making a shoe can be reduced to their most simplest function and then given off to workers to do in the most cost-effective and time-effective way. So instead of having one person making an entire shoe, you just get one person making the laces, one person making the soles, one person making the top of the shoe, whatever, and then eventually just slapping them all together, and you have a quickly made, efficiently made product. And this, for Adam Smith, allowed the capitalist mode of production to really come into fruition. But the thing is, if you're listening to this, you're probably like, whoa, wait, wouldn't it have been the capitalist mode of production that allowed the division of labor to happen, not the other way around? And that's a fundamental tension in Adam Smith's book. He's like, I don't know what came first, chicken or the egg. But what he does add is that capitalism came about through the steady accumulation of wealth, which permitted people at some point not only to be producing their own products, but to start hiring people to work for them. And so in Adam Smith's formulation, capitalism is a process by which people become free from having to be attached to their own land or free from any other restrictions, and they're free to go and work wherever they want. And so he describes this kind of itinerant, that is, moving around, always kind of never staying still, working class that moves wherever they're going to be paid the most. It's an idyllic way to think about capitalism, but it's, in any case, this is what he gives us. Now, Karl Marx has no time for this. That is, he thinks that this idea of previous accumulation, that is, people were just steadily acquiring wealth and then this eventually transformed into the capitalist economy. For Karl Marx, he's like, really? Are we really going to paint the origins of the capitalist economy in such idyllic, rosy terms? Where he's like, in order for the capitalist economy to function, indeed, Adam Smith is right. It requires people to be, quote unquote, liberated from having to work on their own land so that they can become wage laborers and so they can work technically wherever, at least on paper. This is the idea. Karl Marx is like, do you think people really wanted to give up their land, sell it to capitalists, and force themselves to then work in wage labor? Do you think that people acquired massive amounts of wealth just by the toil of their own, the sweat of their own brow? That is hardly the case. And Karl Marx is like, in order for the capitalist economy to actually develop in the way that Adam Smith suggests it, required that there was massive colonialism, dispossession, violence, thievery, all to accumulate the resources necessary to develop the capitalist economy. But more importantly, well, important is the wrong way to put it, but another element of this that Marx highlights is that for capitalism to work, what needs to happen is the people, that is, the mass of people that will be workers who will be exploited because workers are never paid what they actually earn the company that they work for or the business they work for. If they were paid that amount, what they actually earned the business, then that company would no longer make profit within a capitalist world. Karl Marx is like, in order for that to happen, capitalists do this thing, and this is just part of the logic of capitalism, where it acquires private property. And it does so to such an extent that it takes away people's capacities to actually earn and own land. Many people today who think they own land really don't. It's owned by the bank, and they pay a mortgage to that bank to essentially rent out the land under the veneer of owning it. And eventually, if they pay off the mortgage, they can sell it and make their money. But still, in any case, this is hardly like what humans are meant to do in like working on the land. An asterisk, Marx isn't saying we have to go like back in time to this time when like humans had this idyllic relationship to the land. That's not what Marx is saying. He's saying that there was this steady process of capture that took away people's opportunities to actually work on the land and to self-subsist, making them dependent upon the capitalist mode of production for them to even work and live at all. So this so-called thing called previous accumulation or primitive accumulation, Karl Marx thinks that Adam Smith totally whitewashes history, totally erases all of the violence, all of the dispossession, all of the like change in the forced change in logic that permitted the capitalist mode of production to develop and flourish. And he's like, Adam Smith, like, you're totally missing the point here. Now, some people interpret this to be a little bit different. So if you read Karl Marx's Capital, he often puts in quotes primitive accumulation or calls it so-called primitive accumulation. And one of the interpretations for that, one of the ideas is that for Marx, or some people have interpreted Marx to use the word primitive to suggest that it was like violent, as though he's associating primitive people with violence. But that's not, at least some people interpret that that's not what actually he's doing, because he's borrowing the term from Adam Smith and others to say that primitive accumulation is to use that term just implies as though it was like the kernel stages of capitalism that slowly organically developed into capitalism, where Marx is like, it wasn't organic and it wasn't idyllic and rosy and just, this beautiful thing that flourished into capitalism. It was actually incredibly violent. Hence why he says it's quote unquote so-called primitive accumulation. He would really prefer to call it something like violent accumulation or, I don't know, violent dispossession, whatever. Something that is a lot more punchy than just suggesting that it was a before capitalism, which takes out all of the negative attributes of it. Now, one of the lingering products of this development has been the accumulation of debt. That is not only taking away people's abilities to work the land, but to put them into a state of indebtedness so that they'll never actually emerge from. Because this perpetual state of indebtedness produces the conditions for them to have to work to continually pay off a debt that's often based on interest, which means it's always going to be accumulating so long as the interest rates and the payments aren't actually, made, because they're often designed in such a way as to be impossible to actually crawl out of. What this does, and the capitalist mode of economy does this on a broad scale, is that it reduces everyone to the state of indebtedness, where they feel like they must work and work and work just to earn the right to live. And there's been this incredibly pernicious logic that has seeped into so many people's minds. I'm in America right now, same thing in much of the rest of the West, is that at some point someone convinced us that in order for us to live, we have to work a minimum of 40 hours a week, when human beings really don't require that much labor to sustain ourselves. Like 40 hours a week over however many years to eventually maybe possibly earn a break. Like what happened to normalize that? Like that is so absurd. The only way it has become normalized is because it's not meant to sustain humanity and really the needs that humanity has, but to sustain the logic of profit and accumulation that extends far beyond what humans actually need, like way far beyond, and then becomes purely about the very process of growth itself, which is what, is one of capitalism's defining characteristics. It is growth for the sake of growth. It extracts surplus value from labor power and from laborers through their labor power, and then translates that into growth that then demands hiring more laborers to be exploited, and so on and so forth, until eventually the Earth's resources are depleted. The labor force no longer actually has the energy and the power to sustain the system that's been created, and everything crumbles into the sea. That's kind of Marx's vision. But then perhaps a phoenix will rise and we will see. But yeah, let me know, thinking about this term, like how did Marx really approach primitive accumulation? What was his actual view? For anyone who happens to know a little bit more about that, I'd love to know. But yeah, on that note, hope you like what I did. If you did, you can like, share, subscribe, and I'll catch you on that note. Take care.